Foreign ministers are calling Syria's downing of a Turkish military plane unacceptable, and they've slapped more sanctions on President Bashar al-Assad's regime. The EU said Syria should comply with an urgent and thorough probe of what exactly happened. NATO, of which Turkey is a member, is also scheduled to meet and discuss Friday's attack. Today's new sanctions on Syria add to a list that includes a ban on oil exports and sanctions against members of President Assad's family and top officials. Right now in Syria, the fighting does rage on, with the Assad regime finding itself increasingly under pressure. Amateur video shows forces continuing their assault on the rebels' stronghold of Homs. But this new round of shelling comes amid reports that high-ranking Syrian military officials and dozens of soldiers slipped across the border into Turkey. Their defection comes as tensions rise between the two countries. Syria shot down a Turkish warplane last week after it claimed the jet strayed into its airspace. Turkey maintains its jet never breached Syrian territory. David Harris, terror expert and director of Insignis Strategic Research, joins us now live from Ottawa. David, good to have you with us.
Thanks, Karen.
Let's start with this fresh wave of sanctions. This is the newest information. These were issued today. What does this tell us about the seriousness of the situation in Syria right now? And David, how the community, the international community, is responding to it?
Well, it's hardly clear and not very compelling or convincing as a signal of the seriousness of NATO, Europe in general, and other Western countries. After all, this kind of butchery that we're seeing, well documented and have seen for many months now, has been an ongoing focus of significant attention worldwide. And what do we see by way of sanctions? But the kinds of things, pressure specifically on the presidential elite and associates, the kinds of things that one might have imagined would have taken place many a month ago had we all been very serious about this. So it's an extraordinary kind of situation. On the face of it, yes, the very idea of sanctions suggests a seriousness of purpose, but the nature of these sanctions coming as late as they are seems extraordinary.
When we're talking about the umpteenth time that these sanctions have been applied, what is another viable option?
Well, I suppose it's obvious to say that some form of military option might be rather seriously taken by the regime. The problem is, of course, that there's an absence of political will, and it appears that Western interests have been spending more time trying to avoid the military option and possible outcome, a la Libya, than really working in favor of it. And I wouldn't suggest, incidentally, that that avoidance is a position that's ill-taken. We already have seen some of the legacy of the so-called Arab Spring, and the advent, of course, of the Muslim Brotherhood at the most significant levels now of the major Arab country, Egypt, is testimony to what exactly we're dealing with. The concerns about al-Qaeda in Libya, and so on and so forth, and not excluding the apparent presence of al-Qaeda increasingly in Syria, notwithstanding the fact that the Syrian regime, well-known lying entity, claims that it's so, should be a further problem that we've got to think about. So all in all, it looks as though we're all stuck in a bit of a quandary and a dilemma, and paralysis in material terms is ruling the day.
Yeah, it certainly feels that way. In terms of the defection, which we've reported of now, dozens of Syrian soldiers, this happened overnight to Turkey. They crossed the border, they brought their families with them. What do you make of this? And more importantly, David, what do you think the Assad regime makes of this?
Well, again, this is going to be a complicated situation, but very telling, it would seem. A number of people at high levels, presumably among the most privileged of the Assad dictatorship, are voting with their feet. That would imply that they have limited confidence in the ability of Assad's regime to hang on, and they're going to be as well aware as anyone of what could happen to them as former associates of the president should the regime be overthrown by the kinds of radicals who might be available. But from an intelligence perspective, this is an extremely interesting development, because these people might very much have valuable information with them. Indeed, it is fairly common for those who defect from any number of backgrounds to take with them so-called called meal tickets, which is to say specific information. And these people being military, they might have some very relevant information, including the nature of Syrian defenses, very valuable details concerning ground-to-air missiles, which would be highly pertinent to any sort of military action the West might contemplate, and so on and so forth. Some, if they have had adequate exposure to Syrian intelligence itself, may have some insights into what Syria is up to or has been up to, even in our own Western countries.
So they're voting with their feet and they're walking over with a great deal of intel. All right, David Harris, terror expert and director of Insignis Strategic Research. Always good to have you with us, David.
Thanks again, Karen.